Randy Scott names 6 stars he knows who had to hide the fact that they were gay. Randolph Scott was born in Orange County, Virginia, on January 23, 1898. His full name was George Randolph Scott. He was a well-known figure in American movies. He is best known for his serious parts in westerns that made an age of tough, good-hearted movie heroes. Scott grew up in Charlotte, North Carolina, and came from a well-known Southern family. His father, George Grant Scott, was a certified public accountant, and his mother, Lucille Crane Scott, raised him with a strong sense of right and wrong and Southern manners. Scott went to the Georgia Institute of Technology as a young man and then the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where he developed his love of theater and the arts. His early years were shaped by his desire to be sporty, do well in school, and serve in the military. During World War I, he joined the army and worked as an artillery spotter in France. He gained a quiet power and calmness from this experience that would later show up in his movie roles. When the war was over, Scott went to Los Angeles in the late 1920s to try to make a living in the movie business. He met the famous director Howard Hughes through family ties, which helped him get his first small parts in silent movies. Directors quickly became interested in him because of his height, good looks, straight jaw, and calm attitude. Scott got his start in Hollywood with parts in movies like The Far Call, 1929, and The Virginia, 1929. During the 1930s, he was in a wide range of movies, such as adventure dramas, romantic comedies, and crime thrillers. He started getting bigger roles in the early 1930s. His big break came with parts in movies like The Last of the Mohicans at 1936 and Rebecca of Sunnybrook Farm, 1938. But Randolph Scott really became famous in Western movies. He was one of the most famous and well-liked Western stars of all time by the 1940s and 1950s. But it wasn't until the 1940s that he really found his place in the Western genre. His quiet but authoritative personality struck a chord with viewers. Randolph Scott had a long and successful career that lasted more than 30 years. He was in more than 100 movies, with more than 60 of them being westerns. Scott, unlike many of his peers, worked hard to make his on-screen image strong and consistent. He played the lone cowboy a lot, a moral and unwavering figure who stood up for justice, protected the innocent, and moved through the harsh wilderness with quiet dignity. In the 1950s, he worked with director Bud Betticher and scriptwriter Burt Kennedy on a number of well-reviewed westerns, such as 7 Men from Now, 1956, The Tall T, 1957, Ride Lonesome, 1959, and Comanche Station, 1960. These movies, which are often called the renowned cycle, are now seen as works of simple storytelling and psychological depth that shows Scott at the height of his creative powers. Randolph Scott's acts were so interesting not only because of how he looked, but also because of how he could show inner strength and personal code without using big gestures or a lot of words. His characters were rarely one-dimensional, even though he was often played as the good guy. Many of them were guys who had been hurt by loss or violence, but were still sure of what was right and wrong. This mix of toughness, vulnerability, and honesty made him a fan favorite and a choice of directors. John Wayne and other Western stars were known for their larger-than-life bravado, but Scott's parts were more subdued and introspective, giving a more realistic picture of frontier masculinity. He also knew how to run a business well, investing carefully in oil, real estate, and other things. This helped him retire comfortably in the early 1960s. After his last movie, Ride the High Country, 1962, a classic directed by Sam Peckinpah that was a fitting end to his career. In that movie, Scott and Joel McCrea played 2 old police officers facing the end of the Old West. It was a beautiful farewell to the movie business, just like Scott's own exit from it. Scott was a very liked and respected person in Hollywood his whole life. Professionalism, discipline, and quiet kindness made him a hero, but he never won an Academy Award and didn't seem to try. Instead, he earned the respect of both peers and critics for the quality of his work and the honesty he brought to every part. His work in American movies, especially westerns, will be remembered forever, and it has influenced many actors and directors since then. Directors such as Martin Scorsese, Clint Eastwood, and Quentin Tarantino have said that Scott's work helped them understand how to tell stories through characters and how to make movies with complex morals. It was Randolph Scott. He was married twice in his life, but his personal life was not nearly as public as his role as a cowboy on TV. This was his first marriage. In 1936, he married Marian Dupant, an important American actress and horseback riding athlete. Maria was from the famous Dupant family, which was one of the most powerful and rich in American history. Her French-born great-grandfather Eleuter Iron Duan de Nour started the eye production, which grew into one of the biggest and most important chemical companies in the world, and played a big part in both American industry and global trade. Her father, William Dupant Sr., was a key figure in growing the family's industrial empire. It's interesting to note that before she married Scott, Marian was married to George Somerville, a horse breeder and athlete from Virginia. By chance, Randolph Scott had been the best man at Marian's first wedding, which suggests that they had a close personal link and knew each other before they started dating. There aren't many details about how Scott and Marian went from being friends to getting married, but their union brought together two people from very different backgrounds. One is a rising star in Hollywood, and the other is a wealthy socialite with deep roots in East Coast royalty and horse culture. Randolph Scott and Marian Dupant were married for a short time, even though their relationship seemed fancy and well-bred. In 1939, after only 3 years together, they split up. There were no children from the marriage, and some reports say that their personalities and ways of life may not have got along, especially since Marian had strong ties to horse country in Virginia, and Scott was becoming more dedicated to his film business in California. Still, there was a strange and lasting connection between them. Even after they got a divorce, Marian Dupant decided to keep the last name Scott. This could be a sign of continued love or appreciation for the time they spent together. For the rest of her life, almost 50 years, until she died in 1983, she was always known as Marian Dupant Scott. During that time, she became a very important person in American horse racing. She made the Montpelier estate in Virginia a major place for training and competing horses, and she later gave it to the National Trust to protect its history. Scott's second and last marriage was to actress Patricia Stillman. It lasted longer and was more satisfying for him emotionally. Scott was having a great time with his movie business when he married his wife in 1944 during the height of World War II. Patricia was born in 1919, 21 years before Scott. She worked in Hollywood for a short time, but she quickly left the attention to focus on her family. Randolph Scott's second marriage to Patricia lasted longer, was more stable, and was based on shared beliefs. They stayed together for more than 40 years, which is very unusual in the entertainment business and shows how close they were. To grow their family, the Scotts decided to adopt 2 children in 1950, 6 years after they got married. Their daughter is named Sandra and their son is named Christopher. There may have been personal, medical, or private reasons why the couple chose to adopt instead of having biological children, but it was also in line with their desire to live a quiet, family-centered life out of the spotlight. Even though Scott kept going, he kept playing until the early 1960s, but by the mid-1950s, he was slowly cutting back on his work, which gave him more time to focus on his family. The family lived in a fancy house in Beverly Hills. Scott was famous in Western movies, but in his later years he was known as a loving husband and father. He died in 1987, and Patricia was by his side until she died in 2001, more than 10 years after he did. Randolph and Patricia Scott gave the impression of a respectable home life, which was very different from the often troubled personal lives of many of their Hollywood peers. Their marriage, which wasn't very public, passed the test of time and is still an important part of Scott's personal legacy. In Hollywood's golden age, looks were everything, and Randolph Scott knew this better than most. Scott was a big star in westerns and a model of tough masculinity. He also lived in a time when being gay in Hollywood could ruin a career in an instant. Later in his life, Scott reportedly had a rare moment of compassion when he talked about the personal problems of some of his closest friends. These were men whose jobs and public personas were often very different from their private lives. He talked about 6 famous artists he knew who were gay, but had to hide their sexuality from the public because of social norms and pressure from their studios. Carrie Grant was probably the most well-known name on Scott's list, and she was also the person who knew him the best. In the 1930s and early 1940s, they were known for being very close and lived together in a Santa Monica beach house for more than 10 years. The press called Grant and Scott bachelor roommates, and they were often pictured in their own homes, eating together or lounging by the pool. This gave fans a glimpse into what many have assumed was a romantic relationship that was carefully hidden as friendship. Even though both men married other women in the end, rumors about their relationship have been going on for decades. The need to hide the truth was a painful reality of the time for Scott, who stayed friends with Grants for life. One of the most sensitive and emotionally raw players in Hollywood was Montgomery Cliff, whose name Scott also brought up. Cliff was known for his troubled parts in movies like A Place in the Sun and From Here to Eternity. His real-life problems often mirrored those in his movies. Even though Cliff never came out as gay, everyone in Hollywood knew he was gay. He had a lot of inner conflict that was made worse by the expectations of his job and the terrible car accident that left him physically and mentally scarred in 1956. Randolph Scott, who saw Cliff's sadness and self-doubt personally, felt very sorry for a man whose brilliance was hidden by the fact that he couldn't live openly. M.V. Griffin may be best known today as the friendly talk show host and music mogul who created game shows like Jeopardy and Wheel of Fortune. But behind the friendly public persona was a man who was very private about his personal life. Griffin never talked about being gay in public, even though there were whispers about it for years. There was another side of him that Scott knew well, the one who had to carefully balance the two worlds of fame and privacy. Griffin built a media company at a time when being caught could ruin it. So the stakes were not only personal, but also financial and business. Fans loved Jim Nabors as the clumsy but sweet Goomer Pyle on The Andy Griffith Show and its spin-off, Goomer Pyle Usm. Scott also said that Nabors had to hide his real name. Long-term partner Nabors was Stan Cadwallader. The two were finally able to get married in 2013, just before Nabors died. But when he was at the height of his fame, his neighbors had to carefully watch how the public saw him so that he wouldn't cause any trouble. A persistent urban tale said that Nabors and Rock Hudson were married when they weren't. This made Nabors very upset and showed how harmful and dangerous Hollywood's rumor mill could be for gay performers. Cesar Romero was known for his charm and single life. He was cast in many slick parts and was best known as the flashy Joker in the 1960s Batman TV show. Romero never got married, but he kept up a public image as a ladies' man. In the business world, his sexuality was a well-kept secret. Scott liked Romero's style and wit, but he felt bad about how much he had to hide his personal life from the world. Scott said that he was a man of great worth who deserved to live and love freely, but was not allowed to because of a society that didn't forgive. Rock Hudson, the last of the 6 names Scott gave, may be the most sad example of how strict things were back then. Hudson was the perfect man in 1950s Hollywood, appearing in romantic comedies and dramas with leading ladies like Doris Day. Hudson was actually gay, and his agent Henry Wilson made sure that his secret life stayed hidden. Wilson was an expert at grooming young male actors for fame while keeping their personal lives secret. People didn't know the truth until Hudson was told he had AIDS in the 1980s. When he died in 1985, it changed Hollywood and the rest of the world. People became more aware of and compassionate about gay people and the AIDS crisis. Scott was sad about both Hudson and the years he had spent hiding from everyone. He had seen Hudson become famous while being kept secret. Randolph Scott wasn't just telling lies or spreading rumors when he named these 6 men: Carrie Grant, Montgomery Cliff, M.V. Griffin, Jim Nabors, Cesar Romero, and Rock Hudson. He praised their bravery, understood their pain, and gently criticized the strict rules of society that had kept them from speaking out. Scott didn't like talking about his personal life, but what he said about Hollywood in the past and how brave it was just to stay alive there said a lot. Randy Scott died in Beverly Hills, California, on March 2, 1987. He was 89 years old. Researchers say that he died of a mix of heart and lung problems that are common in older people, especially those who may have been exposed to smoking or the conditions of older Hollywood sets. Scott had mostly stopped being involved with public life in his later years, choosing instead to live a quiet, private life away from the attention he had gotten as a Western movie star in his younger years. Fans, colleagues, and film historians all praised his death, even though he lived alone. They saw him as a towering figure in classic American cinema, especially in the Western genre, where he had established himself as a symbol of steady heroism and moral integrity. Randolph Scott was buried at Elmwood Cemetery in Charlotte, North Carolina, after he died. This was the place he picked because it had a lot of personal meaning for him. Scott was born and raised in Charlotte, where he spent his formative years before Hollywood called. His funeral, there was a symbolic return to his roots, showing that he stayed connected to the South all his life. Many famous people are buried at Elmwood Cemetery, which is one of the oldest and most historic cemeteries in the area. Scott's grave has become a simple but meaningful pilgrimage spot for fans of his movies and legacy. Scott getting married to Patricia Stillman. Scott had been married for 43 years, which is a very long time. They got married in 1944 after meeting in the early 1940s. People thought that their marriage was one of the more steady and private ones in the often troubled world of Hollywood. Together, they kept their privacy very strong by avoiding the celebrity party scene on purpose. Instead, they chose a life based on family, love, and shared values. Patricia was by Scott's side during the last few years of his work and after he retired. She was a constant presence as he went from being a movie star to a regular person. She lived 17 years longer than he did and died in 2004. In keeping with their lifelong bond, Patricia was buried next to her husband at Elmwood Cemetery. This made their link even stronger in both life and death. In their later years, the couple lived in a unique mid-century modern home in Beverly Hills. It showed off their sophisticated tastes and the style of architecture popular after World War II. The house, which had open floor plans, clean lines, and natural materials, showed how elegant the couple was without drawing attention to itself. The house was torn down in 2008, which is a shame because it had historical and design value. Not only did it destroy an important piece of mid-century design, but it also took away a physical link to a golden age of Hollywood and one of its most famous stars. Randolph Scott's impact, on the other hand, goes far beyond his body and things. The Randolph Scott Papers, which are all of his personal papers, were given to the UCLA Library Special Collections when he died. This huge collection has a lot of different things in it, like rare photos, carefully chosen scrapbooks, personal and business letters, handwritten notes, published pieces, and even the original house plans from his Beverly Hills home. These papers give us a unique look into the actor's personal and professional life. They show how he went from being a young man in North Carolina to becoming one of the most famous leading men of his time. The collection is useful for film historians and scholars, and it also shows how careful and deliberate Scott was in his life outside of acting. His voice and ideas will live on through these preserved documents, giving future generations a better understanding of a man who, despite playing the strong, silent cowboy on screen a lot of the time, left behind a legacy full of depth, character, and historical importance.